The leather was new in places and old everywhere else, and whoever had done the work knew which was which. Harlan Beckwith stood in the doorway of the barn with the saddle across his forearm, turning it in the morning light that came slanted through the east-facing gap above the loft. The stitching on the near side skirt was tight and even, the kind that would outlast the hide it held. The cracked tree had been reset and shimmed, not replaced, which meant whoever worked it understood that the original wood had already shaped itself to the horse, and that a new tree would start breaking in all over again. That was knowledge. That was not guesswork. He had bought the place 2 months ago, the Caldwell property on the edge of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming Territory, the year being 1884. He had bought it to have something to do after the grief, which was still too large to name directly, and which he was managing by keeping his hands and his ledger both occupied. The previous owner had cleared out to Denver and left behind a barn, a bunkhouse, a cook stove that pulled to the left, and 3 Mexican ponies that needed sorting. He had brought his own stock, his own tack, his own cook, and his foreman, a quiet man named Dillard Pruitt, who had worked for him for 11 years and who never asked more questions than a situation required. What Harlan had not arranged for was a saddler. He had sent the saddle into town with Dillard 3 weeks ago to be repaired at the single leather goods establishment Garrison, Wyoming offered, a storefront run by a man named Abe Tolliver, who did adequate work at unhurried speed. Dillard had brought the saddle back yesterday afternoon and set it over the hitching rail without comment. Harlan had not looked at it until this morning. Now he stood with the weight of it across his arm and felt something he had not felt in some time, which was a small, precise surprise. Abe Tolliver did not work like this. He carried the saddle back to the house and set it on the table, which his housekeeper May objected to and which he ignored. He sat down across from it and put on his spectacles and examined every inch of the repair. The gullet had been cleaned and the rawhide around it replaced entirely. The fender stitching on the left side, which had been pulling, had been redone with thread that was a slightly different color, not from carelessness, but because whoever worked it had matched the thread weight rather than the dye, which was the correct choice and the less obvious one. He sent for Dillard. Dillard came in from the yard, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at the saddle on the table and then at Harlan. "Who mended this saddle?" Harlan asked. Dillard looked at the ceiling in the way he did when he was ordering his thoughts. Tolliver was out sick. His girl was running the shop. Harlan looked at the saddle again. His girl. Dillard shrugged in the economy of his way. She said she could do it. I did not see a reason to ride back empty-handed. What is her name? Nora. Dillard set his hat on the rail. Nora Tolliver. She is about 20, I would guess. Maybe less. She did not charge full price on account of the tree shim being her idea and not on the original work order. He set the spectacles down. Tell her I would like to see her. Nora Tolliver heard the message secondhand, which was how most things arrived for her. The foreman from the Beckwith place had stopped in that morning while her father was doing inventory in the back room, and he had spoken to her directly, which not everyone did. She had been in the shop since she was 7 years old, which was when her mother passed and her father brought her along rather than leave her in the house alone. She had been cutting, stitching, shaping, and finishing leather for most of those years. She was not formally trained in the way that carried a certificate or a male name on a sign. She was trained in the way that meant she could take apart any piece of tack, understand why it had failed, and reassemble it better than it came. Garrison was not a large town. The people in it were accustomed to the shop belonging to Abe Tolliver and did not update this understanding when Abe Tolliver was ill or tired or inclined to drink and call it a headache. Nora ran the shop during those times without advertisement, because any advertisement would have invited an opinion from someone who had not yet learned that the work did not care who held the awl. She was 22 years old, though she looked younger to people who expected to see a man and were disappointed when they did not. She told her father about the summons from the Beckwith ranch, and he looked up from the ledger with an expression that was difficult to read. Go if you want. He has cattle money and a new property, and things are always breaking in on new properties. She rode out on the roan the following morning, which was a Tuesday in October, the sky the color of old pewter and the grass already winter pale. The Beckwith land was broader than she expected. She had heard it described as the Caldwell place, but the Caldwells had let it run down, and it was already showing signs of someone paying attention again. The fence lines ridden and repaired, the irrigation channels cleared. The man himself met her in the yard. Harlan Beckwith was older than she had expected, somewhere past 50, with a rancher's frame that had not gone to softness and a face that had lived in open weather long enough to have taken its permanent shape from it. He wore no pretension. He looked at her for one moment in the way people did when they were recalibrating, and then he did not do it again. He crossed to the yard gate and stopped. "Miss Tolliver." "Thank you for coming." She stepped down from the roan and looped the reins over the rail. "You had questions about the saddle." He shook his head once, which surprised her. "No questions. I want you to take a look at the rest of what I brought up from Cheyenne." The tack room held 12 years of accumulation, which was how long Harlan had been ranching at his previous property before he sold it and moved north. He showed her in and stood in the doorway while she moved through it. She did not rush. She handled each piece the way she had been handling leather since before she could read, which was to say she handled it the way you handle something that has history and therefore deserves a certain respect. She found 2 bridles that needed reconditioning, a breast collar where the D-rings were about to fail, and a pair of hobbles that were not worth saving, and she said so plainly. He asked the price. She gave it. He asked when she could start. She told him she could give him 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, since her father was not well enough to be left alone every day, and the shop still needed minding. Harlan nodded once. "That is agreeable." She expected him to show her out. Instead, he said, "May makes coffee in the morning. You are welcome to it when you come." She looked at him. "Thank you." She was not used to being included in the domestic arrangements of a property she was hired to maintain. It was a small thing, and she filed it away without comment. She rode home through the gray afternoon and told her father she had taken the work. He nodded. "Beckwith is a fair man." Or so I hear. She thought about the moment in the tack room when he had looked at the hobbles she condemned and simply said, "Agreed," without the long pause men often inserted when a woman made a judgment about something they owned. She turned back toward the door. Fair is not a small thing. She settled into the rhythm of Tuesdays and Fridays over the following weeks as October moved toward November, and the cold began to arrive in earnest. She came early, drank the coffee May set out in the kitchen alongside the men who were breakfasting before chores, and went to the tack room where the work waited. The tack room had a small wood stove that she learned to light herself, because the first Tuesday she arrived and found it unlit, she simply lit it rather than asking, and after that it was understood that the stove in the tack room was her domain between sunup and mid-afternoon. Harlan Beckwith did not hover. This was unusual. Most men who were paying for something checked on the thing being done for them at intervals that communicated distrust without stating it. He came into the tack room perhaps once a morning, asked if she needed anything, and left when she said she did not. On the 3rd Friday, he brought a second cup of coffee and sat on the barrel near the door and said nothing for a time while she worked the stitching on a set of reins. She did not find the silence uncomfortable. She asked after a while whether he had run cattle before or come to it later. He said he had come to it from freighting. He had driven freight in Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory for 8 years, and the money from that had become the first cattle, and the cattle had become this. She said she had never been south of Laramie. He said there was not much in the Oklahoma Territory she was missing. Flat and argumentative. She laughed before she meant to. He looked slightly pleased with himself. the way men did when they had said something that landed, but he did not press it. She held up the rein she was working and checked the tension on the new stitching against the old. She had a set of leatherworking tools that had belonged to her mother, who had learned from her own father before her. Nora kept them separate from the shop tools, which she regarded as functional, and from her personal purchases, which she regarded as investment. The tools from her mother she regarded as something else, and she had never found a word for it that did not sound sentimental when she said it out loud. She used the scratch-all from that set on the reins because the hole spacing was finer than the shop tools allowed, and as she drew it down the leather, Harlan Beckwith watched without asking what she was using. On the fourth Tuesday, he asked. She explained about the tools and where they came from. He listened with the quality of attention that meant he was listening and not simply waiting for her to stop. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Your mother did this work. She set the awl down briefly. She taught me to. My father taught me the business of it. My mother taught me the work of it." He considered this. Those are not the same thing. No, they are not. She set the awl down on the workbench. It was old enough that the handle had conformed to a specific grip that was slightly smaller than her hand. She had been growing into that grip for 15 years. November brought the first hard weather, and with it came Lloyd Castle. Castle owned the eastern section of what had been the Caldwell Grant, a piece Abe Caldwell had sold off in 1881 to settle a note, and he had been expanding his operation into the grazing lands between his property and what was now the Beckwith line since before Harlan arrived. He was 43 and large in the way of men who had grown large on the back of other people not saying anything. And he came to the Beckwith house on a Monday afternoon when the temperature had dropped to somewhere near useful and the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did. Nora was not there on Mondays. She learned of the visit from Dillard, who had a plain man's gift for recounting the facts of an unpleasant thing without flinching. Castle had come with 2 of his riders and a quitclaim deed for 40 acres of the north pasture, which he claimed had been part of his original purchase and had been incorrectly surveyed. He had presented the deed to Harlan in the parlor with the confidence of a man who expected the document to end the conversation. Harlan had looked at it and said he would have his solicitor review it. Cassell had said there was nothing to review. Harlan had said he would have his solicitor review it. Cassell had left, but before he left, he had gone through the yard, and the tack room door had been opened for ventilation the previous Friday when Nora was there, and one of the men with Cassell had looked in and said something to the other man that Dillard did not repeat, but described by implication. "What did Harlan do?" Nora asked. Dillard paused in the way that suggested he was choosing his words. He told them the yard was not a thoroughfare and asked them to see themselves to the gate. She turned it over. He did not argue the substance. Dillard looked at the gate. He did not need to. She thought about this and went back to the work on her bench. The quitclaim matter was not resolved in a week. It extended into December with letters between solicitors, during which time Lloyd Castle twice rode his cattle across the northeast corner of the Beckwith pasture without asking, which was the kind of deed that announced itself as routine while being nothing of the sort. On both occasions, Harlan moved his own cattle clear without confrontation and had his fence repaired, which was the correct response and also the slow burning kind that Cassell would eventually miscalculate. Nora understood this because she had grown up watching her father manage customers who tested the edges of transactions. There was a version of patience that was concession, and there was a version that was position, and only one of them ended in a clear line. She did not say any of this. Harlan Beckwith did not need the daughter of a saddle maker explaining cattle land disputes to him. But one Friday in December, she arrived to find him in the tack room himself, not riding. He was standing at the window that looked north, where the sky was low and woolly and leaning toward afternoon snow. He had a coffee cup in his hand. He had forgotten he was holding it. He did not hear her come in, and she did not announce herself, but went to the stove and began building the fire. When the snap of the kindling reached him, he turned. "Miss Tolliver, I did not hear you come in." She had been there 10 minutes. She said nothing about that. She asked what was happening in the north pasture. He told her about the survey. He told her the original land records showed a discrepancy that was not in Castle's favor, but the copy of the deed Castle held had been witnessed by a county registrar who had since moved to Utah and was not easily reached. He was displaying the contained quality of a problem he could not yet resolve through any available action, and she recognized it because she saw it in her own face sometimes when her father was having a difficult week and there was nothing to do about it except wait for it to pass. She worked through the morning while he stood at the window or sat at the barrel or moved in and out as the chores required. Around noon, May sent food out, which was not usual, and Nora thanked her and ate beside the stove. After a time, Harlan came back in and sat. "You are easy to be around." He said it as an observation he had not yet made out loud, not a compliment precisely, more a thing he had noticed and finally named. She looked at him and then at the work in her hands. "I will take that as a compliment. It is intended as one." She set the work down. Outside, the first snow began to come off the mountains in earnest, the kind that arrived sideways and made the barn disappear from the house if you looked in the wrong direction. She stayed until the snow stopped and then rode home in the white quiet, which was heavy and complete. January was hard everywhere in the Powder River Basin that year. 3 ranchers in the area lost cattle to the cold, and 2 more lost fences to the weight of ice, and the general character of the community turned, as it did under hard weather, to the business of whether neighbors were behaving like neighbors. Lloyd Cassell was not behaving like a neighbor. In the second week of January, he filed a formal complaint with the county land office claiming the 40 acres and attached 3 affidavits signed by men whose names Dillard recognized as Castle hands. This was not subtle. It was the kind of move made by a man who believed volume and paper could substitute for truth, and it might have worked somewhere else. But Wyoming Territory had seen enough land fraud in the previous decade that the county land office was, if nothing else, unhurried in its conclusions. Harlan rode into Garrison on a Wednesday to meet with his solicitor. He stopped at the leather goods shop on the way out of town, which was not his regular pattern, and found Nora behind the counter resewing a bridle. He took off his hat. "You are open in this weather." She looked at him. Her father was in the back with a cough that had been going since November and was not interested in leaving. "We are always open." He set his hat on the counter. He had a quality in his face she had not seen before, something adjacent to agitation. The solicitor's office had given him news. Cassell is putting a third party forward, a man named Greer, who claims to have been present at the original survey and will testify the 40 acres were always Cassell land. She stopped sewing. Was he there? Harlan shook his head. The original survey was done in 79. I have the surveyor's notes. Greer was in Cheyenne in 79 working a freight desk. I can prove it if the land office will hear it. Then let them hear it. He was quiet for a moment. They will hear it. But Cassell has been in this county for 12 years, and I have been here for 2 months. She set the bridle down. You have been here long enough to hire local and pay fairly and keep your fences. She did not say it to reassure him. She said it because it was the inventory of the matter. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as him updating something. He picked up his hat. I will tell you how it comes out. She went back to the bridle after he left, and her father, who had been listening from behind the curtain as old men with nothing to do will do, said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at the curtain hem. He is a decent sort. Yes. For a rancher, her father added, in the way of men who have spent their whole lives in the service industries of other men's ambitions and have earned the right to a small qualified reservation. The land office hearing was set for the last Friday in January, which meant Nora's workday at the Beckwith Ranch happened to fall on the same day. She arrived early and Harlan was already dressed for town, which he had not seen before. He wore a black coat that had not been recently out of the wardrobe and boots that had been polished. He looked like a man who understood the weight of a proceeding. May was in the kitchen, and the mood of the house was the particular quiet of a morning that is waiting for something. Nora went to the tack room. She had brought with her the tools from her mother's set in the small leather roll she kept them in. There was a repair waiting that needed fine work, and this was the day for it. She worked steadily through the morning. Dillard came in twice, not about the work, but because he was also waiting, and the tack room was occupied with something concrete and therefore easier to stand near than the house. After the second time, she asked him to stay and handed him a piece of leather to hold flat while she worked the edge, and he held it without comment. About noon, Harlan came back from Garrison. She heard the horse and then heard his boot on the step, and then he was in the doorway. His face was not a face that showed much. She had learned to read it in small increments, and what she read now was a heaviness that was not quite relief and not quite defeat, which meant the thing was not over. He stood in the doorway. The hearing was continued. The land office wants the original surveyor located. They have written to Utah. She nodded. That is not a loss. No, it is not. He came in and stood near the stove, which was still warm, and looked at the work on her bench. The piece she had been working on was a doubled latigo strap she was resewing after the original stitching had split from age rather than abuse. He looked at it for a moment. Cassell was there. He brought Greer. The land office looked at Greer for about 30 seconds and asked how long he had been in Wyoming in the fall of '79. What did Greer say? He said since '77. She raised her eyes. Harlan nodded. He said it right in front of the clerk. The clerk wrote it down. She set her work down. You have him. When they find the surveyor. But yes. He sat down on the barrel by the door, which had become his particular place in the room, and she went back to the strap. After a while he said, I have not thanked you properly for the saddle. She looked up. You hired me. That is thanks enough. I hired you because of it. But what I mean is, it was the first time since I came north that something went as well as I needed it to. He stopped. That is harder to explain than it sounds. She understood it. I think you mean that the world was cooperating with you. Just in a small piece of it. Just for a moment. He looked at her directly. Yes, that is what I mean. She turned back to the strap. My mother used to say that the work cooperates. That on a good day the leather does what it is supposed to do, and the thread goes where you put it, and everything holds. She said those days were a kind of answer. He was quiet. What is the question? She finished the last set of stitches and nodded off and cut. Whether any of it is worth the trouble? The answer is yes. That is what she meant. She held up the latigo strap in the light from the small window. The stitching was even, and the leather was flat, and the repair would outlast the next decade without complaint. Harlan Beckwith looked at it for a long moment. She was right. February came cold, and stayed cold, and the Cassell matter settled into the background, the way unresolved things do, when there is nothing to be done but wait. Nora continued her Tuesdays and Fridays. She finished the reconditioned bridles, the breast collar, a headstall that had needed a new crown piece, and 2 sets of working reins. She started on the winter sorting of the remaining tack, which was the kind of inventory work that nobody enjoyed and that she did not mind. Harlan was in the tack room more often now, not hovering, but present. She did not analyze this. She accepted the company the way she accepted the stove and the morning coffee, as a condition of the place. One Tuesday in the 3rd week of February, she brought a small package of fry bread because she had made too much the previous evening, and May had the week off to visit her daughter in Casper. The kitchen was functional, but impersonal without May in it, and she thought a gesture toward the practical would not be unwelcome. Harlan looked at the fry bread as though he was not sure what to do with it. She set it on the workbench and went to light the stove. "You do not have to eat it." He ate 3 pieces before noon. She told him her mother had made it differently, with a little lard and a lot of heat, and that she had never quite matched the texture. He said it was better than anything May made, which was high praise since May was a fine cook. She said May would scalp them both if she heard that. He said May would agree once she stopped being offended. They ate the last of it at noon with the second coffee, and outside the snow had quit, and the light was the particular pale gold of a Wyoming February afternoon, thin and far away, and still sufficient. He set down his cup. "I should tell you that Cassell has pulled his affidavits." She set down the coffee. "When?" "Yesterday. His solicitor wrote mine. The land office found the surveyor in Salt Lake. He is coming in March to testify, and Cassell apparently decided the testimony was not going to be in his favor." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it finished?" "He will have to clear the title formally, but yes, in substance, it is finished." She turned back to the stove. There was a feeling in the room that was warm and complete, and she did not want to disturb it by saying something unnecessary. After a while he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask if you would consider a longer arrangement. Not twice a week, full time. There is enough work here for it, and I would match whatever Garrison offers and add a room in the house if you want to stay over on the far days rather than riding in weather." She looked at him. He was looking at the fry bread wrapper, which was a piece of cloth she had brought it in. He was not a man who looked away when he was avoiding something. He was a man who looked at the nearest neutral object while he waited for an answer. That is a substantial offer. It is a fair one. Which is different? She thought about her father, who was better than he had been in October. She thought about the shop, which was her father's in name and hers in practice, and which would probably outlast her patience if she stayed. She thought about the tack room with the small stove and the work that cooperated with her, and the barrel by the door that had shaped itself to the man who sat on it. "My father would need someone to manage the shop on the days I am here." He nodded. "There is a boy in town, Ames, who does leather work. Not fine work, but adequate. Your father would train him." She looked up. "You have thought about this?" "For some time." She looked at the work on the bench. The winter inventory was half done. She could see 3 more weeks of steady work in what remained, and after that, a whole spring of maintenance that a working ranch required, and that she had not yet begun to plan for. "I would need to talk to my father." "That is right." She began rolling the tools back into the leather case, the old ones from her mother last, and most carefully. "I will bring you an answer on Friday." He nodded and moved toward the door and then stopped. "Miss Tolliver." She looked up. "Nora." He said it as though he was confirming that the name was hers, which it was. "Whatever you decide." She finished rolling the case closed. "Whatever I decide." The tone was not agreement or disagreement, but acknowledgement of a thing said plainly. He went out, and she heard his boots cross the yard toward the barn. She sat for a moment in the tack room with the stove ticking and the afternoon light coming in and the tools in the roll on the bench in front of her. The scratch-awl was the last thing she had packed, tucked into the narrow slot her mother had made for it, the handle worn to that particular small grip that she was still, after all these years, growing into. She talked to her father that evening. Abe Tolliver listened without interruption, which was unusual for him, and then he was quiet for a time, which was also unusual. He was sitting in the chair by the cook stove that had been his chair for 20 years, and the lamplight was soft on his face. Abe Tolliver looked at the stove for a long time. "He has cattle money." That was not what he meant, and both of them knew it. "I know." "What did he say?" She told him, word for word. Her father had the habit of wanting the words themselves when something mattered, not the paraphrase. He listened and said nothing for another long time. He paused. "Not for the money." because the work wanted her, and she was the right person for it. She looked at her hands. I am the right person for it. Her father nodded. He was not a man who showed much, and in this way she resembled him. But in this moment, something moved across his face that was too complicated to name, and that she chose not to look at too directly. "Will Ames do?" she asked. "He will not do what you do, but he will do." She set her coffee down. She had known what she was going to say since the tack room, since the afternoon light, since the tools rolled back into the case with the awl in its slot. She had come home to give the answer in her own voice before she delivered it, which was how she made every important decision, not by thinking until she knew, but by speaking until she heard what she already knew. "I will tell him on Friday." She rode out early that morning, before the cold had fully lifted, and the road from Garrison was still iron hard under the roan. She came in through the east gate and crossed the yard, and the barn door was open, and Harlan was inside. She dismounted and led the roan out of the cold, and he looked up from the horse he was working and waited. She stood in the barn entrance. The morning light came in past her and fell across the floor. Yes, one word. She had thought about whether more was required and had decided it was not. He was still for a moment. Then he set down what he was doing and came across the floor and stopped at a distance that was considered and not close. "Thank you." The word carried the weight of someone for whom gratitude meant a great deal more than its syllables. She nodded. She led the roan to a stall and began unsaddling, which gave them both something to do with their hands, while the thing they had just decided settled into the air around them and became real. After a time, he said, "I had May put the room at the end of the south hall in order, in case you wanted to see it before you committed to staying over." She loosened the cinch and looked over the back of the roan at him. She did not say that the word yes was already a commitment in full. She said, "I would like to see it." He showed her, after the morning chores. It was a quiet room with a south-facing window and a small chest of drawers and a hook on the wall that was the right height for a leather roll. She did not say any of this. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the window and the light that came through it. "It will do." He stood in the doorway. "May will have coffee in 10 minutes. She turned away from the window. "I know where the kitchen is." He almost smiled. She had learned what that looked like. She went to get the coffee and then went to the tack room, which was warm because Dillard had lit the stove, and she unrolled the tools on the bench in the order she always used them. The scratch awl went in its place at the top right, in the small depression in the wood that had formed over the months she had been working there, the impression of where she set it when she was done with it each time. It had not been there before she came. It was there now. She picked up the first piece of work. Outside, the morning had opened up into the pale clear of a Wyoming winter day, the sky wide and very blue, and the land stretched out under it in every direction as far as it went. The ranch was quiet, with the productive quiet of a place that had found its footing. The cattle were in the north pasture, the fences held, the title was clear. She worked through the morning, and the leather did what it was supposed to do, and the thread went where she put it, and everything held. Her mother, she thought, would have called it an answer. She believed she was beginning to understand the question.